Welcome back to the class. Today is the final discussion on Weber. This is the last class on Weber. We are having a critical assessment or a critical evaluation of Max Weber and his overall contributions to the discipline of sociology. We have had several sessions, I think 9 classes including this. So we could spend some time in discussing Weber in a rather elaborate manner, trying to understand his overall contribution for the methodological as well as the substantive theoretical contributions of Weber. And let us have a look at Weber. Let us have a critical evaluation at Weber, a critical assessment at Weber, trying to position Weber among the different sociologists and try to understand to what extent Weberian arguments and Weberian theories have stood the time, and to what extent they have influenced the further course of the discipline and its trajectory over these decades. So one of the very important points is about the nature of theorization of Weber. Weber did not believe that timeless universal laws could ever be developed because so much that had occurred in history was the result of chance events. This is something very fascinating. Maybe for the first time that you are listening to a scholar who very explicitly states that he does not want to or he does not believe in creating huge theories or very all-encompassing theories, a kind of a timeless theories or laws for that matter, which can be applicable to every society. Okay, because you know that this had been the trend ever since the time of Montesquieu or Auguste Comte or Spencer, even Durkheim and even Karl Marx. Okay, all of them had they exhibited this urge to develop meta theories that can explain almost everything according to them. But here comes Weber and makes a much humbler, much important, at the same time important invention, saying that a timeless universal law could ever be developed because so much had occurred in history was the result of chance events. A host of things, okay, which had happened in different societies were chance events. Okay. They were not really created by conscious human events. They were not really created by a set of people who wanted to achieve certain things. On the other hand, they were simply chance events. And you can't have a theory that cannot really look into each of the specificities. On the other hand, what Weber says is that the trajectories of different societies are so different. Okay? The historical, social, political, cultural background or cultural context of different societies are so different that it's almost impossible to create a law that can incorporate all these diversities and all these complexities. And without the ability to conduct inquiry into the same ways as in the natural sciences, Weber still wanted to be scientific and objective. So his argument is that you can't really replicate social science or you can't really mold or fashion social science after a natural science. You can't have a social physics. You can't have a sociology which looks exactly like a physics. Okay, it's not a weakness, rather it's a strength. That's a point what Weber argues. You can't have sociological laws. You can't have sociological laws like the laws in chemistry or in physics or in biology or in astronomy. You can't have that because there are so much of different complexities. There are so many different contingencies and chance events and complexities, and you can't have that. So even without the ability to conduct inquiry in the same way as the natural sciences, Weber still wanted to be scientific and objective. So this is the point. So we mentioned already in the previous class that Weber brings in a very strong anti-positivistic streak. Okay, he brings in a very strong anti-positivistic orientation to social sciences and especially that of sociology. But at the same time, he wants it to be scientific as well as objective. And I hope you remember we had some elaborate discussion on what it means to be objective and what it means to be scientific. Moreover, he sought to do more than write historical descriptions. he also wanted to provide a methodology for more abstract and analytical statements. So it was not only a sociologist trying to do a historical analysis of certain thing, but he went into more nuances. And one of the best examples is his study on capitalism, as we have discussed elaborately. Okay, so Weber was not merely tracing the origin of capitalism. It was not a study on the emergence of capitalism. I hope you understand that there are quite a lot of economic historians have done that, and how and where did capitalism emerge, what were the who were the major players, what happened, what were the policies. So that comes in the realm of economic history, whereas Weber was interested in a sociological analysis, trying to understand how certain religious beliefs, certain cultural elements, certain ethics really gave a kind of impetus for the emergence of capitalism. So he also provided a methodology for the more abstract and analytical statements about the historical changes. So that is why this concept of ideal type becomes important. He presents the story, he presents the image of the spirit of capitalism in its ideal typical formulations. And then he tries to understand what is the ideal typical characterization of a Protestant ethic. And then he could make a connection between that. The result was a strange compromise, the study of historical causes through the vehicle of ideal types, exactly what we discuss now. So he tried to understand the historical causes of different subjects, but different phenomena, but through the vehicle of ideal types. And you can have a lot of discussions and debates about the positive as well as negative effects of using this ideal type, but Weber personally found it as extremely important. Now, Jürgen Habermas, maybe one of the most important leading intellectuals of our times, the German philosopher. Habermas thinks that Weber's discussion of the paradoxes of rationalization is still the best key to a philosophically and scientifically informed diagnosis of our culture. So it is Habermas's argument that Weber's explanation or Weber's theory on the paradoxes of rationalization. So what is the paradox of rationalization that we discussed the other day? I hope you remember that. So Weber argued that in the modern times things are becoming more and more rationalized. We are aiming for more and more efficiency. But in this pursuit for more and more efficiency, there are a lot of substantive values are lost in between. Okay, you can't have a highly value oriented as well as a highly rationalized goal oriented means at the same time. They may not go together. Remember Weberian discussion on social action. Okay, he distinguishes value oriented action from that of goal oriented action. Goal oriented action is the typical instrumental rationalist action where your only goal is to achieve your destination, your end in the most efficient manner. Okay? Whereas when it becomes the kind of a goal-oriented manner, your means are not that important. Your ultimate aim, your upholding of the values, your commitment to the values becomes important, and they are not compatible all the time. I'm not saying they are completely incompatible, but they are not compatible all the time. So Weber sees distinctive ethical dilemma of contemporary individuals exemplified in the tension between an ethics of responsibility and an ethics of conviction. Okay, so this is a kind of a conflict that Habermas talks about, the kind of a paradox, which according to him is a philosophically and scientifically informed diagnosis of our time. So what is this ethical dilemma of the contemporary individuals exemplified in the tension between ethics of responsibility and an ethics of conviction? A conviction, it talks about your conviction towards a certain value. It's a substantive rationalization. I hope you remember this distinction between substantive and formal. And it is very difficult to have both these things together. You are in your everyday practices, you're ideologically committed to that at the same time formally as well. So that is a kind of a dilemma between the ethics of responsibility, that you need to do certain things in the most efficient way, but at the same time your convictions might be different. And this dilemma, Weber argues, is something very important. And he is also a cultural relativist, for he thinks that science cannot decide what values people should follow, that our belief system cannot be based on any ultimate truth. A very, very important argument, that which many of his predecessors failed to understand, that you can't really explain, of course you can explain a lot of things with science, but you can't really explain larger questions, you can't explain philosophical questions through science. For example, the whole question about the purpose of life. What is an ethical way of life? How should you behave? Should you behave this way or should you behave this way? What are the kind of values that you need to uphold? Science doesn't have answers to any of these things. What are the kind of moral and ethical positions that you need to uphold, both at your individual as well as at your collective life? Science doesn't have any answer to that. So science gives you a lot of information, it gives you a lot of knowledge, but when human life is not only on the basis of knowledge, but it's also on the basis of values. And Weber recognized it, Weber realized it. So what values people should follow, that our belief system cannot be based on the ultimate truth. Okay, you can't, again we know that science does not have or science does not give you an ultimate truth. Science keeps on revising its truths. Maybe today's truth could be tomorrow's false. So science does not give you that sense of certitude. Science does not give you that sense of permanence. Whereas for a strong believer, if he keeps away his doubt whether the basis of his belief is right or not, but then he gets complete satisfaction of conviction of holding on to something that he thinks is absolutely correct. And at the psychological level, that conviction provides him with quite a lot of solace. It provides him with quite a lot of comfort. Rather than, on the other hand, for a scientist, for somebody who believes in science, these truths are not permanent. These truths today's truth could become tomorrow's known truth, or could be false. Assertions of cultural or religious fundamentalism, the idea that an authentic culture is being undermined by Western modernity and rationalization, occur throughout the world. This conflict between fundamentalism and rationalization may be the most potent and enduring problem of the 21st century. So here the attention is now being brought into a very important process that we see all throughout, which makes a lot of sense if you analyze it through Weberian argument. I hope you remember we mentioned about re-enchantment of the world, where the argument that there is an increased relevance of religion, or religion has made a comeback. In fact, it has made a comeback with vengeance since 1970s at least, because contrary to quite a lot of sociologists' argument or political scientists' argument that the whole world is going through a process of secularization, where religion will lose its significance and it will become a part of your private life. What has happened after 1970s is religion has come back into the public sphere, and usually through its combination with religion and political power. So we saw that phenomenon in India, we saw it in several Muslim countries, several Islamic societies. We saw the resurgence of religious revivalism. So the point is, many of these revivalist tendencies has a long history, because there has been very interesting argument. There have been very interesting argument that most of this revivalism or most of this they emerge from a kind of a contestations with the Western rationality. And if you look into quite a lot of religious reformist movements within Islam or within Hinduism, all of them emerged as a reaction to the influence of colonial modernity. So on one hand, what has happened is and that has assumed the character of a fundamentalism. And here you need to keep in mind that we are not talking about fundamentalism in a negative sense. Okay, what is the meaning of fundamentalism? We often attribute this term fundamentalism in a very rather negative way. But fundamentalism, especially religious fundamentalism, needs to be seen as an urge to go back to the fundamentals of any religion. Okay, there is a newly found call, or a renewed call to its from a religion to its members to go back to the fundamentals, to cling on to the fundamentals more vigorously. And this comes when the elites or the priests think that the community has degenerated both politically, socially and economically, and the prime reason for this degeneration is that the community has moved away from its core values and core principles. So that's a time when the clergy exhort its members, or the priests exhort its members, or the elites exhort their members to get back to the fundamentals. So that is how every fundamentalist movements emerge. But the tragedy or the kind of an irony is that they will be forced to identify or forced to create a set of fundamentals in a completely different context. Because many of these fundamentals of every religion that were identified, okay, they will must be there in the text that is written or in their holy book that is written several centuries ago, and they might be quite vague, they might be quite abstract, they might be quite contradictory. Now they have to reinvent all these things and then make them suitable for the contemporary times, and that creates quite a lot of tension. So this conflict between fundamentalism and rationalization may be the most potent and enduring problem of the 21st century. Rationalization is indeed paradoxical. It promotes principled reasoning so that people can discuss and debate issues in terms of rational principles which apply to everyone regardless of race, social position or gender. This is our understanding. It very closely comes to Habermasian understanding of public sphere. You use your rationality, so you evaluate certain things only on the basis of this rationality. You have emerged as a modern man or a woman, as a modern citizen, okay, who is kind of freed themselves from all the shackles of all the influences of tradition. Okay, their thinking is very straight. They are no longer influenced by tradition, nor are they influenced by religion or blind beliefs or magic. They purely think plainly on the basis of rationality. Again, we know that it hardly happens. But so that is supposed to create a kind of a space of principled reasoning. But it is clear that rationalization also contributed to the disciplinary society. Okay? Knowledge becomes tied to power, resulting in rules and regulations which discipline and control people, destroying capacities for autonomy and creativity. And this is a tragedy of modernity. Okay? Modernity promised you a lot of unfettered freedom. Modernity believed in human potential and individualism. But if you analyze the trajectory of modern societies over the past several decades, we know that we are living in a disciplinary society. A theory heavily contributed or heavily influenced by Michel Foucault, where he talks about each of these connections. The whole connection between knowledge becomes tied to power, and resulting in rules and regulations which discipline and control people. I'm not going into that field, but it's a very fascinating area. Foucault's argument about disciplinary society, how we are disciplined, how we are made docile bodies, how education, health, medical knowledge, legal knowledge, and various mechanisms of controlling the population, how all these things have made human beings very, very docile, okay, very tamed, very easy to control, easy to manipulate. Okay, so there is a contradiction here. Weber argues that the more you become modern, the more free you are, because you are using rationality. On the other hand, we are increasingly becoming a disciplinary society, both at the hand of the state as well as by the hands of these multinational corporations. We know that the whole debate about how our privacy in the 21st century has only become a joke, isn't it? Your most important personal data must have been shared or collected by whomever they want in this era. So while he supported another interesting Question is about women's case. While he supported aspects of women's emancipation in Germany, he did not analyze the ideal women's domesticity, the ideal of women's domesticity that arose during his era. Despite his sensitivity to cultural values, he seemed to have taken masculinity and femininity for granted. And this is again a very important feminist critique of Weber, because feminism offers very powerful critique of scholars, especially of this particular era, because they had not developed a feminist perspective during that particular time. They did not think through that. They did not think about that, because he did not analyze the ideal of women's domesticity, the taken for granted arguments that men are supposed to go out and then engage in public sphere and then work and then bring back money, whereas women are supposed to take care of the domestic affairs. Why? Because women are naturally, okay, this is the point, naturally they are inclined to be at home. They are more homely, they are more kind, they are more loving, they are the nurturing people, they give birth to children. So women need to be staying back at home and men need to go out. And this was the kind of a well accepted cultural trope in every society, including India, including Europe, most of the societies. Weber also passively accepted that. He did not question or he did not deem it necessary even to discuss that. Weber's sober rationalism and his theory of rationalization still have element of a moral tale, a story that reflected many taken for granted European assumptions of the time rather than a scientific treatise on society. Ideas of progress, the superiority of the West over the East, and the good middle class versus the irresponsible workers sometimes creep into his analysis. Again, very interesting thing, because Weber very steadfastly he tries to keep away from the moral positions, unlike Durkheim. We know Durkheim had a very specific moral position. He believed that a discipline like sociology must take moral and ethical positions, whereas Weber did not do that. Okay? Weber, he did not take any particular moral position, but at the same time, as we discussed in the previous class, he had that kind of an orientalist outlook. He believed in this idea of progress as distributed, generated and distributed by the Europeans, and the superiority of the West over the East, the good middle class versus the irresponsible workers. Yeah, because middle class they have the ability to think rationally, whereas the working class, the poor people, they don't have this faculty, and sometimes they creep into his analysis. Weber, more than Marx or Durkheim, sees history as a contingent process and focuses on concrete histories and cultures in his historical sociology. He does not advocate a simple evolutionary model, though his ideas about rationalization seem to suggest such a logic. This is something that we discussed in the previous class. Weber is not fond of formulating, all-encompassing meta-theories. He doesn't want to provide a theory and say that, okay, you can use this theory to explain social change so far in every society. They are very too tall claims. He doesn't believe in that. Okay, and he sees history as a contingent process. A lot of chances take place, a lot of chance events take place, and focuses on concrete histories and cultures in his historical sociology. And this is the most important one. While Karl Marx also attempted that, he analyzed the history of working class in Britain very elaborately, but then he extrapolated that with the rest of the society, whereas Weber will not do that. Weber argues that every society has undergone very specific and contingent historical events, and you can't gloss over them. You can't build a theory without addressing them specifically, without analyzing them specifically, and such a theory will not have any importance. So he does not advocate a simple evolutionary model, though his ideas about rationalization seem to suggest such a logic. He doesn't talk about different stages. He doesn't say that every other society will become like human society. But still, when you think about rationalization and when he connects it with the story of modernization, I think it's pretty clear that he also falls under that trap. So Weber is a more postmodern thinker than either Marx or Durkheim. He ties knowledge to power. He recognizes the link between rationality and social control, and he is suspicious of the claims that conflict between social groups can be eradicated in a morally integrated community. Okay, because many of the most hotly debated topics of contemporary times, the connection between knowledge and power, the relationship between freedom and disciplinary society. Okay, all these things get reflected in Weberian analysis. Okay, so his ties to knowledge to power is recognize the link between rationality and social control. Okay, increasingly in a modern society, we are subjected to increasing forms of surveillance and control, and his suspicion of the claim that conflicts between social groups can be eradicated in a morally integrated community, as in the case of Durkheim. Durkheim believed in that. He doesn't believe in that. So these discussions really reveal that Weber was somebody who think beyond his time, and he was quite sharp to understand the kind of a possible trajectory of his theorization. Yet Weber does not recognize the possibility that societies might be able to develop non-religious ethical positions in a secular world. For Weber, rationality disenchants. It undermines strong moral beliefs. That's another very important point. He believed that rationality will undermine strong moral beliefs and replacing religion with nothing. And that seems to be a problematic position, because no society can live without moral positions, and these moral positions can be quite different. For example, there are very interesting studies which suggest that quite a lot of developed societies, especially the Nordic societies, including Sweden, Denmark, and these societies, they are increasingly becoming irreligious. They are increasingly becoming either atheistic societies or where people don't really care about religion. Okay? Religion is not a matter of interest for them. And these are the places which has the lowest amount of crime, lowest amount of human rights abuses, and the highest human development indices. So what does it explain? So scholars have argued that these societies where religion has been made disappear, alternative value systems have taken over. Sense of equality, sense of human rights, sense of individual right they provide a kind of an important basis for your ethical standing. So Weber believed that he did not believe in a non-religious ethical position. For Weber, rationality disenchants and undermines strong moral beliefs. But of course, these societies are disenchanted societies, but they have something to replace the religion. And it's not that they are enchanted by these ideas of freedom or equality or human rights, but rather they have taken it as an ingrained value in their everyday life. In addition, Weber does not discuss the complexity of cultural identity, the psyche, and the social interaction with such sophistication as he might have. So he doesn't look into cultural identity, he doesn't look into the questions of races or gender or ethnicity or such kind of things, and the psyche and social interaction with much sophistication as he might have done. Weber does not explore exactly how bureaucratic rules are followed, how a shared sense of what rules mean is developed. Of course, we know that he developed only an ideal typical construct of bureaucracy. And while he was absolutely clear that you are not going to see such a completely perfect bureaucracy anywhere in the world, but he did not examine it by himself. He left it for others. He left it for maybe his students or the future generation of sociologists to sociologically, empirically analyze how bureaucracies actually work. These rules were created and sustained in a cultural context, not by isolated individuals who have no connection with one another. So how bureaucracy functions in different societies is a very interesting study. How the functioning of bureaucracy is heavily influenced by certain cultural underpinnings. It's a very fascinating area of study. Weber did not venture into that, but that would have been really interesting. So, while Weber calls for the methodological practice of Westerhen, the sympathetic understanding of others as central part of sociological analysis, he does not sufficiently explore the fluid, creative, and contingent aspects of social interaction which escape scientific categories. Because he was very, particular that every scientist must be able to objectively analyze the subjective dispositions of actors. But there are host of areas where this objective analysis becomes difficult or rather impossible. We discussed that in the previous class. You won't be able to completely execute this objectivity because of your position, your identities, your belief systems, and the impossibility that you cannot extricate yourself from your cultural milieu. It's impossible. How much ever professionally trained you are, you can only try your maximum. So Weber doesn't look into that. There are quite a lot of he does not sufficiently explore the fluid, creative, and contingent aspects of social interaction which escape scientific categories. There are a lot of terms, categories which you can't study scientifically at all. You can't study suffering, for example. How do you scientifically study suffering? How do we scientifically study pain? How do we sufficiently study, the whole cost of memories? Very, very daunting, very, very haunting memories. How do we scientifically study? How do we scientifically study trauma experienced by a community, or because of some, say, religious violence or some natural calamity or something? How do we scientifically study that? Or is there any point in trying to scientifically study that? Why should somebody study it scientifically? Why should somebody study and then quantify pain experienced by a group of people or violence experienced by a people? Can we quantify violence on the basis of number of people who are killed, number of people who are seriously injured? Does it make that study anything better? So latest sociologists have identified that or argued that there are host of important, very, very important central features of human society, human existence, which cannot be or which need not be studied scientifically. You don't need to make even this claim that you need to love. You can't study it scientifically. Compassion, you can't study it scientifically. A sense of serving somebody, you can't study it scientifically. There's no need for that. Science is not that important that every scholar must use its framework to understand that. It is hard to extract a general theory of Weber. Another very common observation on Weber is that it's very hard to extract a general theory from Weber. Rather, what emerges are rich descriptions, ideal types of empirical cases, and complex causal statements on many topics without a general model to guide us. We can say it as a critic, but that's how a scholar Weber was. We know that we discussed about his personal biography. He had a lot of personal difficulties. He had a mental breakdown and he was out of academia, formal academia, for 2 decades. So all these things must have influenced, must have prevented him from say coming out with something more methodical. But and his writings are also kind of highly disorganized, unconnected, disconnected with each other. So it's very difficult to get a kind of complete grasp of Weber. But if you try to summarize, if you try to evaluate Weber, I don't think that I need to reiterate the importance of Weber. You must have already understood that. He's a person of eminent standing who is always seen as one of the trinities of modern sociology. The trinities of modern sociology, along with Durkheim and Marx. Somebody who definitely provided a shift in the preoccupation with the positivistic science. He initiated an anti-positivistic methodological orientation for sociology, and his analysis dialogue with Marx, his contribution to the study of religion, his central theme of rationality, his arguments about action, his arguments about authority, all are very, very fascinating theories. And that is why Weber still continues to be one of the most influential classical thinkers, whether in the field of bureaucracy, action, authority, religion, modernity, Weber is still a central figure. Okay, so I hope you have followed the classes. I would strongly urge you to read more on Weber. He is a very fascinating scholar, and follow the discussion that we had closely. Okay, so thank you for listening. Let us close the class today. Thank you.